Hi and welcome to the Stefan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Are you wondering what is the latest with Lightning Network? What does it mean when channels go large-sized with Wumbo? My guest today is Laolu, also known as Roasbeef, the CTO of Lightning Labs. This show is brought to you by swanbitcoin.com, the best place to auto-stack your Bitcoin in the US with incredibly easy setup and low fees. I personally appreciate that Swan is Bitcoin only, and they're dedicated to Bitcoin education. Go to swanbitcoin.com/Livera to get $10 of free Bitcoin when you start stacking with Swan. And Swan has some news to share. They've had massive demand for daily buys since the day they launched the service. One of the big positives of regular recurring buys is smoothing out price volatility, so buying daily will catch those dips even better than buying weekly. There are a limited number of spots in the Swan Daily Buys beta, so head over to swanbitcoin.com/dailybuys to get into the beta. That's swanbitcoin.com/dailybuys. Are you looking out for your Bitcoin backups and security? Have you got your Bitcoin seed words or recovery phrase backed up? Check out the Cipher Wheel, produced by CipherSafe at ciphersafe.io. It's a wheel-shaped product, and you can put in the words from your seed using the tiles, and it also comes with a padlock tamper-evident seal, so you know if it's been opened. Make sure that you or your loved ones have access if something happens to you. Don't just keep it on that piece of paper. Orders are going out now. Go to ciphersafe.io and use code Livera for a discount. Next is Nox. Nox is a Bitcoin custodian dedicated to ensuring their insurance protection covers the full value of their customers' assets. For example, suppose a fiduciary wants to hold $250 million worth of Bitcoin with Nox. Nox will seek to obtain $250 million of insurance dedicated exclusively to that account and adjustable to volatility. No fractional coverage or narrow scope. Insurance for what it's worth, a tool to transfer risk. Nox is backed by investors such as Fidelity Investments Canada, Initialized Capital, and Inovia. If you are a Bitcoin company, investment fund, trust, or family office, check out Nox for your insured custody. The website is noxcustody.com. And finally, Unchained Capital, Bitcoin native financial services. Unchained Capital are making it easy for you to access multi-signature, and they are providing products in a way that respects the not your keys, not your coins ethos of Bitcoin. So if you're thinking about your Bitcoin security, why not consider going from zero to multi-sig with Unchained? They're offering a Vault Concierge onboarding package where you can get a guided setup call and have hardware devices mailed out to you. And as part of the package, you'll have $1,000 in your vault also. So the prices range from $1,500 to $1,000, and use code Livera for a discount. Also, Unchained Capital have an incredible amount of content and open source contributions in the space, which you can find at their website. Go to unchained-capital.com. All right, so for this interview, we get into a lot of stuff around the Lightning Network. What's the current state of it? What's going to happen with Wumbo, backups, HTLC interception? We talk about Loop as well, some of the attacks on Lightning that are possible, and what are some of the mitigations, as well as protocol upgrades. So make sure you are subscribed using a podcatcher application, and you can make sure you set the speed to a comfortable level for this interview. Laolu, welcome back to the show.
What's up? What's up? Yeah, it's good to be back. I think last time I was here was like 2 years ago, maybe, or something like that. But yeah, it's been some time. And since then, you've kind of blown up since then. So definitely good to see you make some progress on this.
Oh, for sure. Thank you. And you guys have been doing some great work over at Lightning Labs. I was really excited to see some of the work you guys are putting out. And so obviously I had to get you back on the show, man, and hear a little bit about what's going on. But I guess I wanted to maybe just start a little bit more broadly, just Lightning
hmm
Network in generally. We're
hmm
seeing, some real development in the ecosystem. So what are you seeing that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm talking about one thing. I think it's case now it's where it's like, I feel like progressively we kind of like slowly mature the network over time. So like, maybe initially it was a little bit more like just about like, market we have like search space, things like that. But I think now we're kind of like seeing like a bunch of like other like larger companies, all the kind of like, other use cases I didn't think would arise. Like for example, like, Nice Hash like offers like, actually doing payouts and even like actually buying hash rate, which is like a pretty cool thing. I think we also see like a bunch of exchanges get on a little bit more seriously now as well too. I think kind of like what we've seen over the past like year or two is kind of like, Lightning like growing up a little bit more from kind of like just the little like maybe like micro network to something that's like turning into a little bit more than that as far as like, larger payment sizes, and also kind of like, people being more confident in the software itself. I think also generally like the network maturing a lot. Like it's like if you'd say, okay, well, maybe things weren't super, kind of like stable before, but like I think at this point now, like, things are a lot more mature. People like have a lot more confidence in that network, which is really great.
Yeah, so we're seeing things like, as you said, mining payouts mining payouts are now being done over Lightning in the case of NiceHash. So that's a really interesting development in the ecosystem. And people could say, well, in the past, maybe mining pools had to batch the payout, whereas now they
Exactly.
can pay out in a more instant or closer to real time way,
Yeah,
and that's a really interesting development.
yeah, it's super.
And even we're seeing the growth of some of these SATs back type businesses, things like Fold or
Mm-hmm.
Bitrefill. So those are
And then
exciting
Strike
as
too, which is
well.
like launch recently. Recently.
Yeah, and they're built on top of LND as well, aren't they? So that's also another interesting one. And yeah, it's really cool to just sort of see the way this thing is growing up. And now payments are starting to become a little easier to route through. And obviously, we're going to get into
Mm-hmm.
Wumbo and all of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, so let's talk a little bit about some of the recent updates coming from Lightning Labs. So I think
Mm-hmm.
let's chat about Wumbo. So the last time we spoke on the show, you were kind of talking about the idea of Wumbo, but now Wumbo is becoming reality. So
Yeah,
tell us
yeah.
a little bit about that and that experience.
Okay, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so people that don't know, like initially in the network itself, we kind of like had like a like the first kind of like effective like training rules in the network. We kind of like had like a limited channel size, or we're like 0.16 BTC or like 224 satoshis. I think that, that point was kind of something where like I feel like we always try to like make sure we set expectations properly. Try to like kind of like under promise over deliver. The way that's kind of like our style generally. So we all kind of like agreed like initially protocol developers you have a limit on there just to kind of like signal okay well still like sort of rental also kind of like to like cap off any sort of like security issues as far as like like lots of things like that. I think like it's been maybe like 3 or 4 years now at this point, so we got a lot more comfortable with it. And like so like what we call one was basically kind of like channels are basically larger than 0.16 BTC. It's kind of like a really big thing because obviously like right now like I think in the beginning because like maybe people were doing maybe initially more so kind of like micro like once Toshi extensions were else it didn't really matter as much. I think now like people are starting to do like exchange deposits. They're doing kind of like different type of trading. They're doing actually actual real place retail size payments. They're going to gift cards things like that as well too. Basically one was a thing where now channels nodes actually like now signal like it's kind of like an option thing. They want like larger channels. These are really good because now we're kind of like creating effectively like what's the backbone of the network itself, right? So like so I wouldn't imagine like every single user is actually be doing one more channel themselves because like maybe if I have like a 0.16 BTC channel that's like so pretty big, that's like a few $1,000s and like tens of millions of satoshis itself. One was a little bit more kind of like for like the backbone of the network itself. So kind of like the actual part of the network that's connecting like these major services, the exchanges, other like merchant businesses, things like that as well too. So you can say okay, well initially we kind of like had a series of like paths and kind of like dirt roads and maybe like cops and whatever else. Now we're actually building kind of like these like larger like highways, which are kind of like will be kind of like the epicenter of transportation in the network, and we're transporting satoshis rather than like people or anything like that. So
Yeah, that's very cool. So as you were saying, the channel limit has been raised from 0.16 something
mm-hmm.
bitcoins
Uh-huh.
to now where the channel participants, if they want to opt into that, they can now raise that limit and they can go, 1 Bitcoin channel or even more. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess as you were saying, this is really more like for big infrastructure, big nodes. We're
Exactly.
talking about like Bitrefill or Bitfinex
Mm-hmm.
or Zap or people like that would want
Mm-hmm.
to have these big channels. Obviously, if you are a private individual or just an individual with a lot of bitcoins and you want to run a big routing node, well, nothing's stopping you now.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's
Yeah,
also pretty cool that we kind of like reach this level of scale in the network because I think right now maybe it's like a little over 1,000 BTC, and that's 1,000 BTC of like 0.16 channels, right? So like people really had to like really and you get out of the way to get to that side. But I think it's also kind of like shows like we reach this level of scale even with kind of like effectively these trading wheels on the system itself, and I think that's still pretty good because now we can say okay, well now from here on it's a little bit maybe a little more unbounded, kind of like now the network can grow at will basically, and we have some other tools coming along to kind of like let people know where to like better put their funds, kind of like where channels should be open to things like that.
if we do want to do Wumbo channels and things, there are perhaps some additional security considerations that come with that because obviously we're talking about quote unquote hot funds on Lightning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, what are some of the things that people have to think about there when they are doing Wumbo channels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super good question. I guess number one is kind of like maybe people need to think about a little more about kind of like actually who they're accepting channels from because like you don't necessarily want to accept like channel from anyone in the network itself just because like if you accept like a bad channel that can actually kind of like affect like the ability of like other nodes to route towards you because maybe like that bad channel kind of like maybe had two IOPs or whatever else. So number one, I think people should kind of like be a little bit more like wary as far as like who they actually accept channels from because like in maybe the beginning is like it's good but, like otherwise you want to like have like a better like set of like high quality nodes basically because like it's better kind of like have maybe like five or so really good channels than like 100 channels that maybe like half of them were kind of like not there and not really there itself. The other thing, obviously, kind of like just make sure you have like good authentication to your node, like actually lock down, on the kind of like network level to make sure you have like kind of like least principle of access to any individual to the node itself. Obviously, backups as well. So one thing we really spent years ago is basically this concept of like SCP, which basically allows you to kind of like close out the channel in the case that you maybe like lost like a lot of the data itself. Like you actually close the channel and get it back on chain, and obviously kind of like any sort of like replication that you have going on there. So I think now all the major implementations like have some sort of kind of like replicate database as far as like the back to their node. this is really important because otherwise, like, you kind of like eliminate that single point of failure because otherwise, if your node blows up, that's it. But now you can actually have kind of like a database failover and actually have like, more advanced architectures as far as like, different nodes. Another thing we work on as well is kind of like, adding a lot more like support for like, PSBT and kind of like, different like pub key import stuff. Like right now with LND, you can actually like fund a channel from like external wallets. Like let's say I can actually have, most of my funds on the code wallet itself, and I can use my hardware wallet to actually fund Towns Lightning itself. Then like the next thing we're going on there, maybe we're ready by time for .12, maybe .13, like, allowing you to kind of like effectively have like a Lightning node, like an LND node that's actually kind of like more of a shell. So basically like it has like purely only pub keys on the thing itself, and it actually requires a kind of like additional protocol to actually do any signing at all. So you can actually have like a Lightning node that's online, actually running payments itself, that actually private keys on the node itself, and kind of like delegates access to those keys elsewhere. So this kind of like lets you kind of like separate security and have like different access control policies to make sure that things are moving the way they should be.
I see. So, as I understand you there, and I think Chris Stewart has also spoken about this at the recent Lightning conference. He was talking about this idea of the different keys that are required to be hot, and so because only some of those keys actually have to be hot, well, then now we can start doing things where it's a bit more of an advanced setup where people can say open a Lightning channel from the hardware wallet and have it closed directly back to that hardware wallet.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
in the meantime, they obviously some aspects of those keys have to be hot because the channel, or because let's say LND is passing back and forward channel state updates.
Exactly.
So obviously those keys have to be hot, but the other keys don't necessarily have to be.
Exactly. Yeah, and like we're looking at other different modes as well. You can actually have LND like running kind of like a pub key only mode. So, like let's say I have like an XPub. Like let's say I have like two LNDs. Like one's kind of like actually like offline. The other one's like maybe online itself. I can initialize the offline one, basically like then click on series like pub keys or XPub, insert them into the one that's online basically, and then kind of like have a protocol between the two that's like meeting any signing itself. So I can kind of like have smart automated systems to make sure that like if the box gets popped, it's like not necessarily like the private keys go directly, and kind of like have additional like layer of security there too. So I think we're definitely looking at, and it's been something like kind of like a slow progress because like obviously to make sure we're designing it properly and kind of like also keeping up with the actual ecosystem as far as like the way the new standard involvement. But I think we're looking pretty good here as far as like people being a lot more confident, kind of like having like more funds onto their system. Obviously, like one thing you definitely want to have is basically monitoring. So we have something called LND monitor, kind of like something you can hook up to your LND node. It actually like shows you like graphs of like your peers, like channel size, things like that as well too. Then you can also even set alerts from there on too, because like otherwise if you have like maybe like a few VC on the node, you want to kind of like know if anything happens, and do so pretty quickly, because otherwise you have to kind of like go in there and SSH or log in. I guess the other cool thing we've seen is kind of like a lot of people like making these new kind of like UI for like node management. It kind of like makes it a lot easier to kind of like actually like glance at a node and do other different operations and kind of like do things for far, because obviously the CLI only scales so much, and even me, sometimes I fall over the CLI, so it's really good to see all these additional tools, kind of like rising the ecosystem to like drive things forward, make it a lot easier, and also like just make it easier to understand what's going on.
With the whole backups thing, as I understand, in the earlier days, the channels didn't have that. And then, so that was the new thing that you came out with static channel backups, where, as I understand, it's like a static, I think it's called static remote key. And then, so the idea is then it would then, if that channel were to close, it would then, the funds would come back and hit on, like they'd kind of land back into your on-chain wallet. So that way now you can recover them. But the downside is you have to close that channel. That's the main downside there, right? Currently.
Exactly. Yeah. And like one of the things, like, that wasn't as possible in the past. Like initially we kind of like had something where we actually kind of like had this like random nonce added to like the pub key of your wallet, basically. So like, so before like, in this SCP case, you actually had to contact the other individual. The individual would kind of like give you this like random secret. And then only once you have the secret, you could actually drive the key that allowed you to launch the funds of the channel itself. And then we just call that remote key. Now it's basically just like a direct address, effectively like in your wallet that's actually in the channel. So if they force close, you get your one back immediately. Otherwise, if you force close, you can actually do the whole CSV thing and then get through there. So it's kind of like, it's definitely like a step forward now, because like, you trust the other party like much less, because like now you're no longer relying on them to like, give you this particular secret. But it is the case right now where if you want to recover, you still would need to actually close things down on chain. But and obviously like that's not ideal. But like it's kind of like I view kind of like SCB is kind of like the emergency case. This is kind of like the plan B, plan C, basically. Everything else fails, and then you basically have SCB. But now we're working kind of like up on the hierarchy, where you basically have SCB, and you have kind of like more replicated database systems, and beyond that maybe you have other kind of like more on the fly replication going on. That's something we actually released recently in LND for .11. So we have something called like we kind of like have the initial experimental support for this like database backend called etcd. So like it basically can like run it like database kind of like cluster setting. So rather than like having just one copy of like your state on like a single node or like a single kind of like process, you can like replicate that to make it 3 or 4 or 5 that has failover and things like that as well too. So something that's definitely required, because anyone that's like running kind of like a business on a large scale on the internet has like database replication, they have failover, they have things like that as well too. Now we're seeing all the nodes catch up to like allow people to have similar architectures running on Lightning, which definitely required for anyone doing kind of like large enterprise type deployments, stuff like that.
Okay, so as I understand you there, well, comparing back to, let's say, earlier days of Lightning, I knew some people were trying to do things like rsync, which is like a way to try and copy it over, but that's like not very safe. And as I understand, then
Yeah,
what you're
yeah,
doing
that's super
now
costly.
is a more advanced way of backing it up so that you are backing up the database to another machine so that if your
Exactly.
main machine goes down,
Hmm.
then you would still have, or at least you got a better chance of having the correct up-to-date state,
Hmm.
and so that kind of that's how you deal with kind of the quote unquote toxic backup problem.
Exactly. And another cool thing beyond that as well, you can actually kind of like use the database system for itself to like, have like failover between different L&D nodes. Like let's say I have like three different L&D nodes. Like one of them is actually kind of like the current like, primary like leader basically. Like, if that one goes down, it's going to fill up any of the other ones. It's really cool because you can then kind of like implement like, similar things like kind of like zero downtime like upgrades between all the different nodes. Like let's say like I want to upgrade to like down 12, which is coming out like in a few weeks or whatever else. I can actually then like do that in a way where I don't really have like, complete downtime of my services. Otherwise I want to like make sure everything's highly available to make sure like I can service my customers or, whatever app I'm doing and things like that too. So I was definitely super excited about this because now it's a lot more like it's a lot more amenable to kind of like larger scale deployments and like what people really need to be like be using large amounts of money. Also, just feel a lot more confident because now you can actually have all the state be backed up, but backed up in a way that's actually very secure or like a little more safer because like you're not doing it manually like the RC thing, which like you said, you can kick out of pretty easily.
And while we were just talking about Wumbo now, it's probably also fair to say that we are now seeing more success rate in terms of large payments moving around the network. Can you tell us a little bit about your own? I'm sure you're doing your own little benchmarking and testing on that as well.
Hmm.
What are you seeing on the network?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think it's also kind of like people like reporting to us generally that they're having a lot more success. I think one thing definitely enables that's kind of like people like getting a lot more usage of MVP itself. Kind of like let you actually like split the payments into different smaller amounts, and this is really good because now you're not really relying on kind of like one single channel to like to all your payments. I think generally we're seeing people like report a lot more success and kind of like so maybe initially maybe like people were doing kind of like like one like maybe from 1 cent to like $1. That's just like people doing kind of like different micropayments like things like that. But now we're like seeing a lot more success rate and people going beyond that maybe to like the the 50 to $100 like kind of like realm, and that's also kind of like pre Wumbo. I think one thing what I'm curious about as well is like will people actually close out their kind of like pre Wumbo channels like make larger channels, or will they just like add them basically? So I think we're still yet to see kind of like the full effect of Wumbo, just because like LND itself, which kind of like is really popular routing network itself, was only like really upgrading like the past week or two. So I think we'll probably like maybe in a few months see exactly like what the different what's the additional kind of like impact of the network actually is from there on. But I think generally like people, I think the other thing as well, which maybe is a little bit underrated, is like people are getting like better actually operating their nodes in the first place. It's like everyone kind of had fancy like node being kind of like set and forget. You kind of click the button and it prints money. Everyone wants that like that dream of plugging Raspberry Pi to give you like $20 a month. But obviously that's not really the case because you actually do a lot more active management of your channels. I think people have got a lot better at actually doing things like rebalancing, using things like Loop to actually like move their money different run to get that amount of liquidity. I think it's a combination of basically like like the tooling getting better, but also like the routing operators who kind of like have like level of skill and kind of like insight into actually what they need to be doing. I think they're getting a lot better themselves as far as like tooling, also education too. So it's kind of like a gradual thing, and I'm really excited to kind of see the progress we have going forward.
As I understand you there, it's essentially in the earlier days and perhaps even now there were and there are a lot of zombie channels and kind of
Oh,
just
that too, yeah.
just a lot of nodes that got set up and then didn't sort of get maintained. And then so every time someone tries to route a payment through those,
Hmm.
then it's difficult, right? And so now what we're seeing now is more active management and better tooling around how to
Exactly.
manage your Lightning node, such
Hmm.
that you're doing things like balancing the channels better, or that you've just kind of you have, I guess, your node has a better view of the network. So now it knows how to route those payments better. Um,
Exactly. Yeah, and like it's another thing as well. Like we actually improved a lot in L&D, kind of like the pathfinding aspect, because like before maybe like like very early days, like 2017, L&D would basically forget all of its memory after maybe like 15 seconds. So it's kind of like a goldfish. Basically, like so even if it had a channel like work really well in the past, it would basically never try it again because it basically like consider everything from like clean slate. But now we have something we kind of like call like mission control in L&D. It's kind of like the ability to like L&D can like actually like retain like memory of like past attempts basically. So it's gonna remember, okay, well channel from Bob to Carol, that's I went really good. Maybe like let me kind of like increase the probability of success of my internal models, basically like take the channel again. Otherwise, it can also learn from basically fail successes. Basically, over time, as you make more payments, it can actually progressively like learn more of the current network map itself. This is also even possible to actually like kind of like combine like the type of like memory or like mind share of like other different LNDs into like one kind of like central or database basically to like help you do a lot better pathfinding. That's not really done yet. But I think generally like people found like a lot more success in that because now like LNDs basically learning as it goes rather than kind of like just fumbling around the dark.
Yep, I see. And also, you mentioned some of the tools that are used now to help manage or at least have a dashboard to see what the current state of your Lightning channels are. So, for example,
Hmm.
RTL, Ride the Lightning. There's
Hmm.
Thunder Hub, as you
Hmm.
mentioned, LND Mon, which is by Lightning Labs, and you also mentioned I think there's I've seen also Lit as well. Lightning, is it Lightning
Hmm.
Interface
Yeah, well, it's like
Terminal?
it's like a lightning terminal, and like you can kind of like smush that into lit.
Yep,
Yeah,
you're always good with naming. Hey.
yeah. Yeah, that's what we do.
So, how important would you say, like doing all the rebalancing and kind of the active management of a channel of your channels, as opposed to, let's say, the more, let's call it laissez-faire, just kind of opening a lot of channels? Would you just say that's very Bitcoin kind of capital inefficient to just have a ton of channels and not spend the time active remanaging and so on? Or
Oh.
can you give us a
Mhm.
sense of that?
Yeah, totally, totally. I mean, it's kind of thing where it's like you need to like actually like place channels in the place where they're kind of like most actually demanded, like they're most willing to be used. Because otherwise, I can like maybe put like 20 BT of a network. If I put those channels in basically like quarters that maybe aren't really well demanded, they're just gonna kind of like just like set the rest. I think we see this a lot where people maybe like there was someone like in the past like maybe they put in like 100K in the network itself, like they just do it in kind of like a very like uneducated manner. They didn't really earn like any money at all itself. But then you look at the kind of like other individuals maybe like running Raspberry Pis who basically made a lot more money just because like they were actually a lot more savvy and they actually knew what they were going on. Right? It's like things like if I have like a large channel that isn't actually getting any traffic at all, I can like really have like a large opportunity cost because I can actually, obviously I have that capital elsewhere and would be a lot more effective, right? So I think people are now realizing as well, like they're kind of like watching like social media, they're seeing okay, there's a big launch over there, they're kind of like on these like IRC groups like Telegram or whatever else, kind of like really like put their channels back to like where they're most demanded itself. So I think people are getting better at this over time. We're also working on like additional tools to basically give people like the more insight to like actually where to put their capital. It's like you're saying, it's kind of like a game of like effective capital management because otherwise you can definitely be doing other things with your money, and if you're putting on the network itself, you want to like make sure that okay, well I'm actually getting a return somewhat, or I'm actually like even like routing payments because some people just want to like feel that they're helping the network itself, and I think that's a really cool thing because it's kind of like a very like distributed open access thing where like unlike the internet, basically anyone can come to the network and put on channels and like you can structure route payments themselves, which is really cool.
And also, while we're talking about managing your channels, you could also talk about, we can also talk about the fees of those channels. And so
Yeah.
I guess we're starting to see some slightly more advanced thinking around that also, where perhaps in the
Hmm.
past it was just people would just leave the default fees, but now we're
Exactly.
starting to see a little bit more around manual management of those fees. So, for
Hmm.
example, I've seen LN Big, who's a well-known routing, well, he runs multiple routing nodes along
Yeah,
the
like
network,
20
and
or
I've
something.
seen,
Yeah,
yeah, and they're like big channels and lots of liquidity and so on. And
yeah.
I've
Hmm.
seen he has been saying I'll charge the fees depending on how well balanced that channel is. So if it's not
Totally.
balanced at all, I'll charge a higher fee. But if it is
Hmm.
well balanced, then I'll charge a lower fee. So can you just
Hmm.
comment a little bit around what your view is in terms of Lightning Network channel fees?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's definitely good that people are actually like now starting to like experiment with the fees because otherwise, like like we kind of like start things at the bottom. Like obviously that's not gonna like persist forever because like people actually at one point need to kind of like take into account kind of like their cost of capital, also kind of like operational cost themselves too. Because otherwise, like no one's gonna do anything for free in perpetuity. Like they actually need to get some return. But I think it's really good that we're seeing people kind of like experiment with the fees somewhat. Like something on the big user like interested because like one thing that you can do like basically people like modifying their fees at the routing level can actually like inform people like actually doing client side routing because like for example like I maybe like wouldn't take that like high fee route because like it was unbalanced. So that kind of like gives kind of like clients like as far as pathing wise additional information that makes it like as far as like what they're doing. One thing we've seen as well, like one thing that like so we run something called like Lightning Loop, which basically lets you kind of like move funds in and out of the network, and like that's typically if you want to receive more or send more, kind of like top of the channel. One thing we've seen there's kind of like a pretty like dedicated group of like actual people that are like kind of like realizing that Loop is like a fairly big kind of like generator of like flow in the network itself. They're really like specializing to like kind of like specialize all of their channel placement to basically make sure like Loop actually works in kind of like the system itself. So we're seeing them kind of like optimize the channel placement to basically make sure they're actually earning money. I think one of them tweeted like maybe they earn like $30 in a month basically because like they were kind of like they're helping us like actually service the volume. I think it's interesting because it's kind of like a multi-sided like marketplace or even kind of like like this like a little more complex like actual arena because like you have like us who kind of like maybe like receiving a lot of payments or like have this flow. An individual kind of like can detect one of the things like you know kind of like detect like if you have like an imbalanced flow to actually like put more capital in a particular direction. I think people are getting a lot more kind of like advanced as far as like optimizing things. I think that's great because otherwise like we definitely want things to be self-sustaining. So otherwise like long term people aren't really earning like money for routing, not really going to do it itself. But I think it's a thing where you definitely have to be like very careful as far as like capital placement, like management also kind of like fee schedules. So otherwise you maybe you'll kind of like over allocate your capital and like you can actually put it elsewhere and have a much better time. But yeah.
basically people have to think a little bit about which direction they're placing their channels so that they are more Bitcoin capital efficient. And so theoretically, you want to open a channel in the direction that you believe the flow is going towards. So if you know somebody is setting up a new store and it's going to be a really popular store, well, you want to open channels in that way so that you can collect routing fees. And as
Exactly.
you mentioned, there's a little bit more going into the thought around that. So would you say like routing fees right now, they need to rise basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see them kind of like rising successfully. I think one thing we're seeing as well, like people are actually kind of like using like the actual utilization of their channel as far as like actually if it's routing to kind of like give signals if to basically they should put more capital or not, right? So for example, if I have a channel that gets maybe like I open the channel gets depleted almost immediately, okay, maybe that's really good because now I have like a signal that, okay, well if I open the channel, it's actually going to be used for routing in general versus like opening elsewhere. So I think they'll rise over time. I still think they'll stay relatively low. I think the other thing as well, like which we'll see maybe like a little bit in the future because like there's probably necessarily the case where it's like it's going to be a factor somewhere kind of like on chain fees levels themselves, right? So like if chain fees are very very high, maybe like routing fees come up somewhat, but I would see that maybe like there would still be kind of like some equilibrium where you'd expect still like certain payment types to always be cheaper on Lightning itself. So I think as like chain fees rise a little more, like depending on what's going on there, I think it definitely informs like the marketplace as far as like what people are doing on Lightning itself. I think also just like if people like have very very like high active channels, maybe they feel like as though they need to like actually raise the fees less because maybe like now they're getting like higher volume as well too. And I think one other thing we'll see as well, like maybe in the future, like maybe we'll have kind of like distinct networks or maybe like not networks, maybe distinct kind of like subnets or different topologies as far as the different payment types. Like maybe like there'll be like a group of rhinos that really like maybe like small payments, and maybe they do from like one satoshi to 100 satoshi something like that. But maybe there are other rhinos maybe like a little bit larger, and they only prefer like larger payments. One of the things as well, like in the network, like nodes can actually kind of like set limits on like the minimum the smallest and largest payments they're willing to accept at a given point. So I can say, okay, well my nodes are only for like large payments. I won't even accept any small payments as well. So I think we're seeing that a little bit in the network right now. I think the good thing is like assuming like we have a relatively intelligent client as far as pathfinding, you should be able to kind of like navigate that like network to basically like find exactly like what it's like sub corridor or like subgraph you should be using to actually send the payments most efficiently.
Wow. Okay. And so a couple of things there. So it's like over time, as we see a lot more people join Bitcoin, we're going to see more congestion in terms of the block space market for on-chain fees, and
Mm-hmm.
then that will kind of have this interesting dynamic in terms of what is the impact in terms of Lightning routing fees, because
Exactly.
Lightning node operators have to calculate or at least account for the
Mm-hmm.
on-chain fees of opening
Mm-hmm.
and closing channels. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's some level of opportunism there, right? Like a Lightning node operator can wait until on-chain fees are low to try and
Mm-hmm.
open channels, but
Yep.
there'll be some in cases where maybe they need to quickly close a channel, even if the fees are high, and that's where they're just going to have to basically cop the fee and pay it. But then that will all factor into the routing fees. And
Exactly.
one other thing I'm curious there, it's kind of there's going to be this funny dynamic over the next, well, let's say if we really zoom out and we think over the next 5 or 10 years, there's going to be this funny dynamic where a lot of people might not feel the need to try to use Lightning until on-chain fees get high. Just like how exchanges maybe they didn't have it, some of them didn't have an incentive to get SegWit until the
Mm-hmm.
fees went higher, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of this
Exactly.
funny game of like once it gets really expensive, then people will look for the alternatives. But
Exactly.
then over time, smart engineers such as yourself will find ways to basically pack in more for less, and then that will kind of bring it back down. So this kind of like this
Exactly.
sort of
Yeah, yeah. It's a thing
seesaw
where it's like
effect, right?
yeah, seasonal effect basically like people kind of like utilize the like the resources like the medium a little more like intensely, then we can make it a little more efficient. They have like demand goes up, make it more efficient. It's kind of like this like ongoing battle of that in that kind of like regard. I mean, similar to what you're saying, like to my knowledge, we can see like nice hash. One of the reasons they added like actually like payouts and like deposits and like withdrawals and things like that to their system, that people were kind of like actually demanded it because the people said, okay, well I'm maybe on like a small scale miner, I'm getting like a $20 payout, maybe like eating maybe like 20% of that to fees or whatever else. So I think it's another thing. Well, like I think maybe we'll see like other individuals like actually on customer bases like demand the server to basically adopt Lightning because maybe the customers are basically bleeding out too much on-chain fees. So it's a really cool dynamic where it's kind of okay. Well, people will move to like whatever service they feel like they would service them, as far as the fee level, and also kind of like have this like different dynamics as far as the system adjusting and like making getting more efficient, and also demand kind of like adjusting with all those factors at the same time.
Fantastic. And so, in order to make that work as well, so even in that example where NiceHash want to do Lightning payouts,
Mm-hmm.
I guess the interesting thing there is most of the flow is going in one way, right? So it would be going from the mining pool to the miner. And so then we have to start thinking about, well, what is the like if they've got channels open or or they're just going to be paying out to miners, then
Uh
most of the
huh.
time they're going to be pushing money away from themselves. So they're going to have
Exactly.
to do a lot of swapping in and out in order to make that viable. And perhaps that's where something like Loop comes in. So can you tell us a little bit about Loop and how that would help in that kind of scenario?
Sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, like basically what you're saying is like, in the ideal case is going to be like 50-50. That's kind of like what our like ideal, like, theoretical Lightning network is. Basically, like you're sending, receiving the exact same amount that you have coming in. So therefore everything's kind of like, fully balanced. Like, so one other thing with Nice Hash, I think they actually also like offer, actually beat people like purchasing hash rate over Lightning itself. So I think they have some additional, so I think they're probably the majority, maybe like, sending out, basically doing a deposit. I think they also kind of like have some deposits on their end, basically like, people sending money to them because they want to actually buy some hash rate. But like, I understand like one thing basically Loop does, like you basically view Loop as kind of like, it's almost like a release valve or kind of like an ability to actually like remove water or like money, because I think of like, it's kind of like a series of like, money issues basically to remove funds from the network or kind of like, reply them in the other sense, right? So like I think it's nice has like in that case like they're actually sending a lot more, fund out to themselves. So at one point they basically won't be able to kind of like actually, send it anymore. So what they can do, they can actually kind of like have, coins. The coins can even basically be purely in cold storage. Use something we call like loop in, basically to basically add more funds into their channel basically. And what they do, they kind of like send us like, it's kind of like a special like HLC contract on chain. We basically send them an HLC, over to their end on their node. And then once they pull the HLC, they basically get those funds now. They're able to send more, and then we get those other funds ourselves. So it's also kind of like, it's also like, very trustless, trustless too. It's like one way people using it. The other way that people use it commonly is like, basically in the other direction. So someone's actually receiving a lot of money like over the network itself, maybe there's someone like fold, or maybe like, in exchange for else just doing emergency deposits. At one point, basically all the channels are going to get folded up because now they can't really receive any more on their end. So what they need to do at that point, they basically need to like send out those funds back on chain. The cool thing about this, because like, like they can actually use it to also kind of like minimize the amount they actually have in like any given time. Because like let's say they have every single day they can actually like send the money out, from the channels into on chain address, like they have that be cold. So Loop is basically kind of like, it's, some people call it like a trustless like on and off chain bridge. It's also kind of like a like kind of like a release valve to actually like, put more coins or like less coins in the network itself. Because otherwise, like, because we don't have that perfect 50-50, like this is gonna be necessary for a bit of time.
I see. So perhaps summarizing that, Loop is a way that you can bridge on and off chain. And part of the benefit is that you can keep those channels open for longer without having to do what's called channel churn, right? Like closing and
Exactly.
reopening a channel.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so then I guess just summarizing it then, if you are the kind of person who does a lot more payments than receiving money, then you care about having Loop in, right? So that means you
Exactly.
would make a Bitcoin on-chain payment to this
Mm-hmm.
Loop server and then
Mm-hmm.
receive Lightning money, and now you can pay again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess that would be like, I'm a retail individual and I want to do some spending with Lightning, and I'm got my balance down to zero or whatever, in that as in my local balance is going down low and I need more because I want to spend more, well then I can pay a little bit on chain to receive more Lightning balance. And then as I understand you, then the other way around is Loop out, and that would be obviously the reverse. So let's say I am a merchant, I'm receiving lots of money, and then all my channels are now starting to be full on my side, i.e., my local balance is becoming very high and my remote balance is getting very low. So this is kind of a way to, I guess, flush it out and
Mm-hmm.
get more capacity, right?
Exactly. And like one of the cool things about Loop is that we're actually able to do kind of like a combination of basically both like on and off chain batching. So basically on chain batching and like, whenever we're actually doing any transactions, we'll try to like, bundle different customers together basically to basically have them be in like one, kind of like giant transaction. This is good for us because like, we basically want to spend less money on chain fees, and this is good for them too because then they actually spend, less money, kind of like, doing any sweeps themselves. Like one of the things like basically like the combination of, like Loop and MPP is like really, really cool because like for example, like let's say, like, I wanted to basically use something that wasn't Loop, I would maybe have to like close, like let's say I have like, new channel I want to open, and then I would have to close those end channels all in one. I basically use MPP to basically like, I can like effectively like rebalance like end channels or kind of like, offload or kind of maybe like even like refill them or cut them off. Basically one onto transaction itself. So let's say like, let's say we return back to basically the case we loop in. Let's say I'm like kind of like a company that's maybe like doing community like sending out to other people. Maybe I'm like actually like selling, Bitcoin and Lightning, like, they give me dollars. I give them actually Lightning on the network itself. One thing we can do, they can actually like do a loop in transaction, and then rather than like, just send the money back to themselves, they can actually like, create like n different destinations and basically send those like n different payments to other individuals and then send them right back to themselves. So because you can kind of actually like split up the HLC into some different pieces, you basically have this like this like additional level of batching. You can batch on chain, but also kind of batch off chain. Basically, like, in one loop transaction, you can basically affect n transactions. Sorry, n channel, which is another kind of like force multiplier the system has, which is really cool.
Yep. So as I understand you there, you're talking essentially about a massive efficiency gain. So in that example, I might have, okay, so if we're talking in the loop in example, I might
Mm-hmm.
have, or maybe the loop out example is better. But anyway, loop
Yeah, yeah,
in,
yeah.
um,
Either one.
yeah, I guess so that what that means is I might have lots of channels and I can refill all of them with one on-chain fee. in the
Exactly,
loop in.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
then in the loop out case, it's I'm a merchant, and let's say I've got like 20 channels incoming
Uh-huh.
to me, and
Hmm.
I've exhausted the incoming capacity, and I want to kind of flush it all back out in all of those channels
Hmm.
with. And so if we're kind of comboing loop with MPP, multi-part payments, then you can
Exactly.
flush it all back out in one transaction. And so you can get a lot more chain efficiency for that, right?
Exactly. It's like it's really cool thing. Kind of like, like I guess one of the things like I just is really cool. Kind of something like Bitcoin. Kind of like you always try to like drive that like next level of efficiency, basically. And like okay, we realize okay, well, we can kind of like add like this additional dimension. So I think it's a really cool effect. Like just kind of like running through basically obstacles and problems. You can like find something that's a lot more than like that more efficient. This is really cool because we can actually also kind of like orchestrate like across like n different users as well. So basically, we can actually have a one transaction, maybe actually services swaps, or you can say maybe like 100 different channels, basically 100 different individuals. So it's kind of like packing like more, it's basically like packing more transactions onto a single byte. That's kind of like what's it's all about with what's Lightning all about, like loop, MPP, things like that as well. Basically, like having the most efficient like utilization of the chain as possible, and then from there on, we kind of like have different effects as we make it more efficient. We have to keep it with demand, things like that too. But I think it's one of like really cool effects of the system itself. Kind of like just like having these like technically like these like this like leverage in a sense of like one transaction and actions, and that's really cool trade off there.
Yep. And so for listeners who want to use Loop, what are some of the ways that they can do that? Is that through Lightning Terminal, or what's the best way to use it?
Yeah, definitely depends on kind of like their competency or like exactly like what they're doing. Obviously, terminals like really easy way because like like that's the cool thing about it. It's kind of like it's like one buyer of the packages like L&D loop, some other tools that we're working on as well, and they kind of like the UI all in one. So like, if you definitely need kind of like a visual or kind of like more like GUI type of thing, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, you can actually download the actual binary individually. But like right now, for anyone that's like getting into it, like right now, I would definitely recommend terminal because it's a lot easier because it kind of like gives you the ability to like maybe like select like your end channel they actually want to loop out to. And in the future, we're working on different kind of like automation basically like have it be automated. So like let's say like someone said like I want to be able to like receive 10 BT at any given time, from like 3 to 9 p.m. We can then kind of like set up what's like a cron down, basically do loops in the background, basically make sure the user or like the merchant, the user always able to kind of like have whatever threshold they need, either to be able to receive or send more money. So it's a really cool thing as far as kind of like I mean, it's one thing we definitely work on as well. It's kind of like making all this stuff a lot more automated in the future because ideally right now maybe people have to think about it somewhat, but like we're then kind of gathering like a feedback that we get from the customers, using also kind of like other kind of action plans, basically like optimize the system a lot more, like have a lot more intelligent kind of automation with maybe testing the preferences to the system, and the system is able to carry those out effectively, actually just do it. So it's a little more set and forget. It's like so it's kind of thing where it's like we're trying to get set and forget thing. We're not quite there. It's definitely like an uphill battle, but we're getting there a lot more progressively. People get more advanced. So I'm like really looking forward to like when it's a little more just like straightforward. People like come with the system, start like receiving send money, and that's definitely the dream.
And so in terms of the fees for loop in and loop out, can you comment a little bit on that, on how that pricing works?
Sure. Yeah, so it's kind of like a variable set of fees. So one thing we do, we actually give people like a discount if they're willing to like wait a little bit longer because like for example, like let's say we have like one loop in customer, like ideally we can basically service them like at that particular point. But like let's say we basically okay, well if you want to wait 30 minutes, we basically like bundle you with an individual. It's good for us because then we're able to actually like do on-chain badging to like make sure those two individuals are basically on the same track itself. So like if you want to do like a fast swap, maybe it's gonna cost you a little bit more. But if you want to do like a slow swap, then like basically the slow swap is good for us because it basically allows us to aggregate more individuals onto one single on-chain transaction itself. Right, but right now the fee kind of like varies based on kind of what's going on the chain, also different time as well as or whatever else. So we can have like a range. The range is typically I think it's from excuse me from like like 5 basis points to around like like 40 or so, depending like what's going on in the chain. Because like we also want to kind of like make sure that we can incentivize like people like doing loops, for example, on areas where it's going to cost like less chain fees, right? So maybe it's the case where maybe like we'll give you a quote, maybe the quote on Monday is actually more expensive than the quote on Sunday because like when we basically see like over time like some like very circle thing where typically like chain fees are much lower on the weekends, right? So if we kind of incentivize individuals to actually go on the weekends, we can actually give them a lower price because it's better for us because then we're actually spending less chain fees. It's kind of like a dynamic thing because like we are saying, like you always need to keep into account like, what's going on in the chain and then kind of like these like optional on-chain services. So one thing we do, we kind of like look at the chain, we look at what's going on, we also basically then go try to like, promote batching on our end because it's better for the user and also better for us. And it's better for the user too because like there's also like just less chain interaction in the news, and they also kind of like intermingle with other people interacting too to have some other nice properties.
Yep. So essentially, it varies on some factors such as the chain conditions at the time, as in the block space market at that time, and also whether that user is willing to wait for batching, because obviously batching will be more efficient on both sides if you can,
Exactly.
on your side, batch it
Mm-hmm.
across multiple customers and do it all
Mm-hmm.
in one, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to for each individual customer. But obviously, it depends on that person's time preference as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's one of those important things. Like whenever you're talking about fees or talking about any sort of like on-chain activity, it's all about your time preference basically. And like the things like if users are willing to kind of like have a longer time preference, like wait a little bit longer, we kind of reward them with basically a discount at the fee level as well too. So where it's okay if you want to wait longer, that's good for us. And then we'll also kind of give you some of the savings that we get from that too. So and that's always the major thing. Like how long are you willing to wait? Do you need it now? If you need it now, well maybe you have got to pay a little more. If not, we can kind of have you along with like 20 other people and like do a little cheaper. Obviously, like further out in the future.
Yeah. And the other example could also be if you are just starting a new store and
Hmm.
you fund it with some Bitcoins, but
Hmm.
you need incoming capacity. And
Hmm.
so you might open some channels and then do a loop out to now have incoming
Incoming,
capacity, right?
exactly. Yeah. And like one of the cool things with that, like something we realized in the past, I think we call it like a loop de loop internally. It's like so let's like I open channel that basically do a loop out, right? From those coins, I can then take those coins and looped out, use that to basically open another channel and then loop that out, and then can keep continuing that effectively. So I'm kind of like stringing this capital around in like circles effectively, but at the same time like the money is still like moving around the network. But it basically like gives you kind of like the ability to maybe like open channel one BTC and then eventually get maybe like 3 or 4 BTC as inbound because you're kind of like repeatedly doing these loops. That's another kind of like the cool thing that isn't super used yet, but it's kind of like shows some of the interesting capabilities once you start to compose these things together.
Yep. And with the use of Lightning Labs Loop, how does that compare with say other services? I guess there are some that might use what is more like the trusted swap in or trusted swap out. How does your one compare?
Yeah, it's a good question because obviously you can kind of like do it where like I give you the Bitcoin, you give me like a channel or whatever else, and like so it's something that we definitely try to like shy away from as a company because we typically try to make everything we do because like have it be purely non-custodial. That's really good for us because like the user has control of their funds at all times. There's kind of like less liability on us, and then we also never have the ability to kind of like unilaterally move the user funds on any regard, right? So I think the difference there is like it's just a matter of like if users are comfortable with. Maybe people are a little more comfortable with kind of like doing like smaller amounts with trusted swaps. We just always try to make it basically trusted as possible, just to make sure we kind of like minimize like any type of risk on either end of things. And I guess the difference as well too from those that like I think they're all kind of like operating at like different levels of scales. Like one thing we've seen this year, we start to kind of like scale up with the service, kind of like having a lot more volume, and as a result, I think people are kind of like noticing like the node itself doing a lot more volume, kind of like attracts more routing operators themselves, which basically means we can do more volume, which basically kind of like has different cycles. Like as we're kind of like scaling up, people recognize okay, whoa, like that's a really good node because they're actually doing a bunch of routing, they allocate more capital to us, we kind of like utilize the capital, and it's kind of like a cycle of like this kind of like growth in the system itself. And but yeah.
Okay, cool. And while we're speaking about channels, I've seen some mention of channel acceptor policy. Can you just outline what that is? How would it work?
Yeah, super good question. So, like, I was just talking about in the past, like, it's definitely a little bit better, kind of like have like a healthier set of like, like high quality channels. Like, right now, like, the default for any like Lightning node, like even beyond that leads, basically just to accept every single channel that you have incoming, which is like kind of like a simple thing to do because you can say, okay, well, like they're actually putting money towards me. I don't really have any cost, and maybe like everything's fine. But like things like you may have a cost in the future. It's actually like the channel gets routed through somewhat. You actually need like those funds on chain. Eventually, that thing's well, like like not every node basically is created equal, right? So certain nodes are kind of like have like higher QTs, maybe like kind of like the better connector or whatever else. So the channel acceptance is basically like the ability to like accept or deny any channel that comes in. And then that criteria can be arbitrary. It can be okay, well you're not Wumbo. It can be you only have 3 channels. It can be okay, well you don't have enough capacity. It can be like you're not connected to other individuals. So basically, people can like now like be a little more selective about their channels. So if you kind of see like well if you see maybe there's kind of like abundance of capital in the network itself, you basically want to select kind of like the best capital to like add to your little portfolio because like if the portfolio is like a little lot more healthier, that basically means you can route a lot more effectively.
And so essentially, it means as a node operator, you can be more selective about who opens channels with you. You might say, I want a minimum balance in that channel, or I want you to
Hmm.
be running a certain type of node. Does
Exactly.
it also allow conditions in terms of things like, well, I don't know, maybe this is getting more into like BOS scoring, but does it also allow things like uptime and things like that?
Good question. I mean, it's like the APIs and stuff is like very flexible. So like I could like for say like like let's say I have a node come in, I could like query some other thing, or I can even like compute a score. So one of the things where I think eventually people will maybe usually basically like have a lot more computation than like maybe historical scores or kind of like other node activity. So like the API itself is kind of like it's like there's a new channel. Do you want to accept it or not? It doesn't really kind of like limit you as far as like what your acceptance criteria necessarily is. So therefore your acceptance criteria can basically be anything. So I can say okay, well I only accept nodes that have like a even number of the last hex digit of their pub key, right? right? It can be that arbitrary, or it can be okay. Well, I only accept nodes that are at least 2 years old, that have one BTC in capital, that are connected to this and this and this, that have a score of this, that are, have this particular centrality. So it can get really really advanced. I think we'll tend that a little bit more because the nodes I mean, so I think it's thing like what we're saying as well. Like people want to basically keep their channels open for a long time. Like a long time kind of shows like a level of like reliability. Also, there's also kind of like some of like the Lindy effect there as well, where this individual have like a node for 2 years basically. All the times like 1.5 years old. They kind of like show like kind of like really committed to the system itself. They can like maybe use that to extrapolate as far as like, the quality of the node in the future.
Someone might be concerned and say, well, hang on, does this mean this is how Lightning Network gets permission? Because maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for you to run, your node because now other
Mm-hmm.
people might be really selective in how they
Mm-hmm.
accept channels. And now it's hard for
Mm-hmm.
the individual to set up their own Lightning node. And now it
Yeah,
becomes kind
yeah.
of all through these big, well-known gateways and things. Obviously, that's a bit of a theoretical and I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit. But
Uh-huh,
how are
uh-huh,
you
uh-huh.
thinking about that kind of that idea of kind of balancing off the ability for anyone to be able to use Lightning, but also giving people the ability to be more selective about who they accept channels with?
Oh yeah, super good question. I mean, so I think they're kind of like going like different tiers. That maybe like you have like T1, T2, T3, similar like seems like basically what the ISPs work on the internet. Well, you can take maybe like from the higher tiers, like individuals that like kind of like the backbone of the network itself, and maybe you have kind of like other nodes of maybe a little more kind of like a little more. They're kind of like roads, kind of like connecting interconnecting where else. They maybe have like different paths. I think it's gonna like be kind of like a gradual scale up. Where like you probably like can't go from like zero to like Wumbo mega node basically. Right? You can kind of need to work your way up. Maybe initially you kind of like connect to other nodes that maybe are like at your similar like level of like a score or else. They kind of like progressively like work your way up to things going on there. The other things are like this is something actually isn't built. It's not built for protocol, right? So there's no kind of like whitelist, blacklist in protocol itself or else. There's basically just people like adding additional tooling, basically like allow them to basically separate my channels. I think the other thing, which is maybe a little unseen, is like there's certain class of attacks that someone can launch by kind of like massively like opening like a widespread number of channels in the network itself. And one way you can kind of like guard against that pretty effectively is okay. You can say okay, well I only accept channels from like a node that maybe is like like of at least a few months old and has a number of channels. Kind of like reduce the ability for someone to kind of like basically like rapidly like gain like control of the network as far as like having a bunch of connectivity. So definitely a trade off there. Like I guess I don't think it's gonna be like something where it's gonna be fully permission because like once again it's always optional. I think there'll always be kind of like an ability for individuals to kind of like work their way up as far as like getting from like kind of like zero to hero because obviously no one's gonna like be like an Alex Bosworth type. They're not there at the beginning. They
Yeah.
gotta work their way up, kind of get some credibility, kind of like the different like confidence, and then they kind of like work their way up to get to be better node.
So if you want to be a lightning hero, you got to slowly start. You got to
Yeah,
start
yeah,
one step at a
exactly.
time and work your
Yeah,
way
yeah.
up.
It's like you gotta be like on Twitter, you gotta be on Slack, you gotta kind of like work your way up, kind of like ask some questions. And, like I think progressively people get a lot better because I think we're kind of like probably like a group of like maybe 400 or so radicals, which we kind of like Mario would been there from the start. We kind of like consider those kind of like the like top tier of the network right now, which maybe around that's around like 4 or 5% of the network, which we consider like really really good. I think we definitely want to like grow that over time. It's something that we watch is kind of like what we call like the strong set of the network itself that we kind of like want to monitor and make sure people like connect to them, but also like make sure we can grow that over time by giving people the tooling and education necessary to eventually like rise up and be like what is effectively like a transportation provider in the network itself. It's really pretty cool thing because like unlike like building roads, we can basically add channels instantly, right? And there's very like low cost compared to like construction, like materials or whatever else. So it's kind of thing where you can kind of like very like rapidly adapt the network in terms of like where the actual demand is most needed as far as like what people are routing to, and also kind of like what the barrier to entry is, which I think will always remain low. If you have a computer and some Bitcoin, you can definitely do the network and actually start routing payments yourself.
Speaking to that as well, or to that idea of good lightning node operators, can you tell us a little bit about updates in terms of BOS scoring?
Def. Yeah, so something that like it's something that we haven't officially announced, but like I think we kind of talk about a little bit more. It's like it actually started like a while back. Initially, we were kind of like working on like a number of applications, which we don't really do as much anymore. Basically, the question was okay, like how can we like supplement autopilot, kind of like what's like real time information, like right now autopilot basically looks primarily at kind of like the static network as far as the graph graph capabilities, things like diameter, centrality. I can basically like look at the graph itself. The thing is like just because you have a lot of channels in the graph, maybe like you look effectively well connected, doesn't mean you're actually able to actually effectively write channels in the real time, right? So basically, BOS score is about like actually like adding a little bit more kind of like real time navigate information into kind of like the scoring system itself. So what it's doing is kind of like looking at like your node, looking at the policies, looking like how frequently you send channel updates, what's your uptime, and then nothing does it as well. Actually, it starts like it can also kind of like simulate certain payment flows. So it's going to like actually try to like route through your node to basically see like is it able to actually like walk the walk, right? So things like can look good on paper. Oh, you have like 10 BTC, you're connected to who and who or whatever else. But, like if you can actually route things effectively, that's what BOS course is actually trying to do. It's kind of like actually like get like what are like the real nodes, like ignore the pretenders basically who maybe aren't like quite there yet itself. Something like we're definitely like working on kind of like developing a lot more. We had kind of like had this like recent mailing list where we kind of like show people like where basically like where they were on the list. But obviously like one thing people always ask, okay, well how can I improve my score, right? right? And, they see like I'm on the list, and I got the list. It's kind of like trying to get to like some like exclusive club or something, right? So we're definitely working on like like giving people like the tooling and kind of also make it a lot more transparent, basically like allow people to actually see what's going on there. And I obviously think like ideally like this should be like the entire network ideally, but it's obviously it's still a thing where like people the kind of like some of the knowledge maybe from the toolings will be concentrated in a few individual hands. We're definitely want to like make that a lot more easy to like rise up and actually like be able to like evaluate your node. I actually think people will definitely like also have their own other rating system in the future as well. I think we're kind of like the first to recognize, okay, well, we need some type of like rating system, basically like separate like what or nodes actually affected from nodes that maybe just kind of like just sit there. Because like there's gonna be some individuals that start to take a lot more seriously once more money is actually available. And this is something that we can actually usually basically monitor the network over time. Also, maybe you can recommend other individuals, maybe like new business or whatever else. Okay, connect to these nodes. These nodes are actually pretty good, and maybe actually like better than somewhat.
So it's like over time, the BOS scoring might help people who want to use autopilot. So if they want to be more like a casual node operator, they can kind of rely a bit more on the BOS scoring, I guess, rather than them manually doing things. Is that partly how it might work?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like you can basically view like kind of like bot scores from like these like node races. It's kind of like looking at like the real time activity because like someone can like look like they're a good node, like or their latest version, like blah blah, like they're actually writing effectively is not really gonna help them as much. So basically, like I would view it's kind of like it's like one part of the equation. You definitely want to kind of like have other things like actual kind of like raw R policy actually looking at the network itself. I think it's kind of like more supplementary thing. Just you look at kind of like what the actual activity, what's going on is. The other thing is well, like it's also like very very dynamic. You basically view like well maybe like the current like network topology doesn't really change too much. Like in order for it to change, you can basically require change transactions and take a lot of time. Also can be relatively expensive. While the bot score can basically change, from the hour or like or even the day, or whatever else. Like if there's like big disturbance, or maybe like if a node goes down pretty rapidly, the system will actually react to that because it's also basically doing like active network probing, basically kind of like see what the current map of the network actually is. So it's definitely like a lot more kind of like dynamic and real time system versus maybe someone like looking purely at the graph, which maybe because I feel like kind of people maybe typically look at okay, well that node has a lot of channels, it's gonna be really good, but that's not necessarily true. I can have 1,000 channels, but I can basically just like have my node in the in like my closet and I never touch it basically, and I'm not really gonna be that effective as writing.
One other thing I saw from the documentation was this concept of HTLC interception. So, can you tell us a little bit about that and what might it be used for?
Yeah, it's super cool. So that's something like we talked about like a while back. Like we always kind of like have these like concepts internally, then we maybe like make an issue. But like this company like Breeze, who kind of like has like a pretty popular mobile made only they actually made. So basically the idea is that like like whenever it knows like writing a network or sorry writing actual HLC of a network, whenever they get an incoming HLC, they kind of like run into the policies to kind of like decide okay, well who do I forward this to, right? So the HLC interpretation basically like about like allowing an individual basically like suspend the like forwarding flow of a network or sorry for an HLC, then decide basically where to put it from there on. Like there are a few different use cases. Like one of the biggest use cases I think was kind of like for mobile phones. For example, like, let's say one thing obviously right now in order for me to set the payment, I basically have to have my phone on the entire time. It has to be like fully synchronous process. What HLC in terms of use, I can basically like have a node that maybe I designate as kind of like a mailbox effectively. Like they basically have an HLC coming in, they hold it because they know it's destined for me. They notify me on my phone, hey, like if payment ready, I can click OK, so then when I can set the payment, right? So basically makes things a little more async. That's kind of like just like one use case for it. So basically the ability to like kind of like preferentially like forward or like halt the forwarding of different HLCs up until like some other condition is met. So like if you heard of like HODL invoices, basically HODL invoices for kind of like people receiving payments, HLC interruption basically for people like forwarding payments. That's like one different use case right there, but it has much other things as well in the future that people will start to get mess around with.
Okay, so if I understand that, it's like, as an example, someone like Breeze, for example, the provider of a Lightning services, and they run a wallet. So, as an example, the user might be out and about, and they might want to take a payment, but their phone is off at that time.
Yep.
And so then what happens is Breeze might be taking that incoming payment and using this HTLC interception. Then it will then notify that person, and that could just be like a notification on their phone, like a push notification to then turn on their phone, open their Breeze wallet so that they can now receive the forwarded payment. And as I understand you, the technology or the concept being used underlying is the HODL invoice. And so that's this idea that
it's not exactly HODL invoice. It's more that like basically like so like what it works like anytime you get a payment forwarded, like it basically says okay, well should I forward it like automatically, should I cancel it, or should I settle it? So it's basically the ability to kind of like halt kind of like the operation of the node to basically add your kind of like custom logic. You basically do kind of like a middleware like layer basically where I can kind of add like custom forwarding logic into LND itself. For example, like let's say someone like wanted to have like a brand new like writing protocol, because right now we basically use like engine writing and like search writing. They can basically like add additional information into the payload and then intercept the HTLC and then put it to basically some other routing network which maybe doesn't exist right now, or maybe like some academic thing or whatever else, and then like let it flow through, then eventually like settle in that. So basically it's similar to HODL invoice in that like HODL invoice is basically about like not immediately accepting a payment. HTLC interception is basically not not immediately forwarding a payment. And basically now,
I
instead of
see.
not doing it immediately, I kind of like insert additional logic in there to like decide what I should do with it versus just doing it immediately or forwarding it immediately.
I see. Yeah, yeah. And so, well, I guess one criticism I've heard of that idea when I was chatting with some other Lightning developers is they might believe, well, they see it like that's locking up liquidity along the network. So, what do you
Mhm.
think about that? Is that just locking it up at the end point, or do you see that like, well, that's additional HTLCs across the network because that payment hasn't been released through yet, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, very good point. Because I guess the thing that people forget time like work is like like with HLC like you always kind of like have the worst case delay of like the actual like like TLTB delta sorry TLTB of the HLC itself, right? So like and again someone should basically be ready to basically like always incur that worst case delay. So like like something HLC interpretation of basically hold limits don't really make the worst case delay any worse. Maybe it makes it a little bit like more common depending on what you're doing itself. But I mean, so one thing we've definitely been working on like as far as like something in the protocol is basically we want to like have something like in order to actually even add an HLC to someone's commitment, you actually basically need to pay them. So I feel like if people are more able to like be effectively be compensated basically for their time value of Bitcoin on an ongoing basis, then I think that kind of like resolves a number of issues because like at that point it's like okay, well you're basically leasing my coins out right now. Yeah, I'm getting compensated. It doesn't really matter. So I think we're definitely like missing some of like additional incentive. What I think would kind of like make thing a lot kind of like more cohesive. But I think we're definitely getting there, and we have a bunch of other ideas in that area as far as basically being able to make sure people are being compensated for the capital at all times versus only when they actually forward them successfully, which is the case right now.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess as I understand you there, it's saying, well, right now the Lightning Network rewards successful payments, and if somebody does a lot of this kind of HTLC locking up, they're not actually paying because unless the payment goes through, and so it's kind of that challenge around kind of locking up or jamming up other people's nodes or channels because it hasn't gone through yet. And what you're speaking to there is around like what kind of incentive could be made to
Exactly.
allow or give some incentive for the fact that you are locking up somebody's HLCs on their channel because there's a limit on the number of HLCs per channel, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's as well. So it's basically trying to like it's basically like spam prevention, right? And like what can we use for spam prevention? We can basically use Lightning itself. So basically, like let's say like different nodes, like let's say they kind of like enter into like some different like critical stage where they say, okay, well, in order for me to even forward a payment, I need like the 2% of the payment up front, right? And maybe that's like a negotiable rate. And so I think maybe we'll see some in the future. Basically, people kind of like require some sort of like prepay for them to even before they to actually even forward a payment, they basically need some percentage of the actual like full payment up front itself. But then it has some other issues because like maybe they can give it whatever else. I think it's kind of like something we'll need to go towards eventually, where like people need to be compensated for the usage of capital. Otherwise, like incentives like it won't last effectively, or we kind of like have some other degenerate kind of like things that can be exploited by different network participants.
And I guess while we're on this topic of HTLC forwarding and attacks on the Lightning Network, I'm also curious to get your thoughts on some of those recent papers. For example, there was the flood and loot paper talking about, I think, sort of related to what we were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and as I understand, and so I spoke about this, so listeners, I spoke about this on the recent episode with Christian Decker as well.
Oh, cool.
But I'm curious what your thoughts are on flood and loot and these kinds of attacks around, and how you're thinking of ways that Lightning Network may mitigate those kinds of things.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's like something that like like I guess once lately around like it's not something like it's brand new to basically developers because it's like something that was actually noted in the original Lightning RFA as far as like it's like people remember in the past people had things like time to develop because they were trying to like stop kind of like the attack of kind of like people basically going to the chain at all once. Like it's not something that's new, but I think one of the cool thing with Flow, they kind of like actually start to like formalize some of the actual attacks itself and also give us a lot more analysis as far as what's going on. So I think it's one of the things where as well where it's like it's like so one thing like I think there's definitely like a bunch of mitigation. Number one is like one thing is basically like adding channel acceptors, right? Because basically flood and loot at times requires like some individuals basically like actually like have these additional connections to the network and maybe like do so in like kind of like a widespread manner. So we can we can have like different mitigations to basically ensure people can't do that all at once, and they can't add 1,000 BC all at once basically because people are kind of doing their limiting. That helps out. Another thing that helps out is like one other thing with flood is that like kind of requires the ability for an individual to like not actually be able to get their HLC into the chain at any given point. So we have something called anchor channels because like right now the way it is in Lightning, you actually can't like update your feed once you do like a force closed broadcast, until it gets into chain. So we have something called anchor channels, which basically lets you use something called CPFP or child pays per parent, actually bump up the fee on your transaction, basically make sure you can get into the time. The other thing is well, there's also kind of like a number of like actual limits on channels itself that I can say, okay, well, I only accept a max of like like military HLC or like channel or something like that, right? So I can actually kind of limit my exposures, basically make sure like someone actually can't like go through and actually do this all at once. There's also kind of like additional things like prepay as well. So I think it's one of the things like I think there's no like one solution. Until I think there's kind of like a series like maybe like a bunch of solutions. Some of them basically at the base layer, some of them on the kind of like optional layer, some of them the providing layer, basically makes them a lot harder. But I think the main thing that you wanted to have is basically you want to like also make sure like the attack actually has some cost. I think right now maybe some of the cost of the attacks aren't like high enough, maybe like or kind of like negligible basically. But if we can basically increase the cost of some of these attacks, also like give people the ability to actually either detect or maybe even mitigate some of these attacks, I think then we'll be like in a lot better place.
Yeah. So essentially, a range of mitigations around things that can be done to make that kind of attack more costly or just less technically feasible. And some of those, as you mentioned, things like having channel acceptor policy, the use of anchor outputs, and the limit. So, for example, limiting the number of HDLCs on a given
Exactly.
channel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep, and like there are also kind of like base layer changes possible. For example, like, one thing we talked about in the past is okay, like the ability to like kind of like maybe delay time locks if we felt like the blocks were like basically over a certain high water mark. That stuff kind of like has other kind of like issues because like we say, well, can someone then delay it indefinitely or wouldn't go on from there? So definitely like there's no like simple solution. It's also kind of like a more very like complex kind of a equation because like there are all of these other kind of like actors as well. Do you, like or miners involved or not? Like what's the current change condition? I think the main thing we basically like make sure we can actually mitigate these things at several levels and also give people the ability to like detect if they're going on and also like otherwise. So but yeah, I mean, it's one of the things where I think kind of like by like the pigeonhole principle. Like if someone has like 1,000 transactions, only two can get to the chain at any given point. Some of them can't get in. So it's basically like how do you like actually do proper sequencing to make sure something like that can happen, or either way, or you can actually have proper fee permits to basically express that you want your transaction to get in over someone else's.
And I suppose it might be similar as well for people talking about, let's say, like a channel jamming attack, or like say, yeah, well, I guess for a channel jamming attack, that's probably another similar one where maybe you might
Uh huh.
restrict who connects with you, or how would you sort of think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, like one thing we talked about in the past, like, so let's say right now, like, that kind of requires like an individual basically open channel two and kind of like maybe like exhausting all that capacity channel instantly, right? So it's like so one thing we can do, we can actually kind of like when you get that to actually add to like what they call kind of like flow control, but similar like TCP, you kind of like start slow and then basically increase up. So I can say, okay, well, to start you with, you can only have like 5 different HLC on the HLC on the channel at any given time. Maybe as it settle, like everything goes properly. Maybe I raise that to 20, maybe then 25 as well. So I can kind of like limit exactly like how much you can utilize the channel because like, anytime you're routing towards me, I just have to kind of like put my capital somewhere else, basically like actually make the HLC link itself. So if I kind of like actually mitigate you to like for the beginning and like as you kind of like have like quote unquote good behavior, then slowly on I kind of like ramp up the ability for you to effectively utilize what's going on in the channel. So basically now this prevents someone from maybe like opening like down the channel basically like using all the HLC slots at once because maybe they have to like do a little more kind of like a long range attack or kind of like a long term attack or maybe over several months, which is definitely like a lot more time and like energy or whatever else. Basically they kind of like actually need to like get up to like level what we think a good node is. So we can kind of like make it harder for someone to kind of come to the network and basically like monopolize all the resources. Because it's kind of a thing where it's okay, well, if you're using my like capital, you basically I need to make sure that you're kind of like a good steward basically. So we can have different things like that, and also even at the automated level. Some things are development, maybe something growing out here pretty soon as well. So
Yeah, interesting stuff. And also, you were chatting a little bit about anchor output. So could you tell us a little bit about that? What is an anchor output, and what's kind of the implications around fees?
That's a good question. I mean, so basically, so one thing people know, like, is that whenever you get a cooperative closed channel, you can actually kind of like actually negotiate fees ahead of time because you can then kind of like say, I want 5 side by, you want 10 side by, maybe we'll be in the middle of 7. But like one thing before anchor channel, like you can do like whenever you actually want to force close a channel, like the fee was actually committed ahead of time. So basically, meaning you can adjust it all. So this is a really good thing. So like, let's say like so do kind of like flood attack. Let's like you actually set the fees like when like the fees were very very low, maybe like 3 months ago or else, but right now they're very very high, right? So right now like if someone like launches something like this, you wouldn't be able to actually bump up the fee at all. Maybe that means you wouldn't actually get into the chain. So when the anchor output says basically like adds like 2 new outputs on like every single on the channel itself, basically like one for me and one for you basically, and this is kind of like a very low amount, basically like slightly above dust. What this allows me to do, I can basically use something called CPFP. I can like broadcast the actual commitment transaction itself. I can maybe even do so at like very very low fee. Maybe have like 5 side by 1 side by whatever else. Then like progressively, I can basically use CPFP to bump it up over time. Basically, this allows you for the first time to actually like increase the fee rate on your HTLCs and then also commitment transaction itself, and just make things a lot safer because now you can actually like bump your fee. And also let you actually pay like lower fees overall as well too. So actually, the ability to like actually control the fees whenever you need to do kind of like what is like a unilateral like forced transaction, which before wasn't really possible.
Yeah. So as I understand there, it's like it will upfront cost more to open channels in an anchor outputs world, but the benefit, the plus side is that we can then change the fees. And so I guess the question then is like, do you think on net it'll be better for the network because people can change their fees more
Oh,
easily, whereas
totally.
it compared to the current model?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's way better. I mean, like, it's like I guess one thing is like it doesn't actually cost more for you to open channel. It costs more for me to you to maybe close the channel in certain cases. But like, I think the one thing is like before, like you kind of like had to like guess the future. You basically have to like okay, well, in 2 months where I want to close, maybe it's gonna be like piece 50 cent a buy. And like if you got that wrong, you basically have like very like bad outcomes, right? But in this case, I can actually like maybe like have the fee on my closing transaction just be like what's right above like the relay fee, basically something that's actually gonna get the network, then bump it over time. So I think overall people will pay less chain fees because they actually have like more control, what's going on. I think also it's also kind of very important for kind of like when people are actually forwarding HLC on the multi-op fashion. Like if you can't actually resolve you're not going HLC for the incoming going times out, you can actually like lose funds possibly because then like you kind of like have a race to all the different HLCs. But if you're now able to actually bump the fee over time and to actually have better chance of getting to the chain, like you maybe like it almost kind of like think about like okay, well how much am I going to pay to like settle like a 10 BC HLC whatever else going on, right? So kind of like a different like cost there. But I think it's definitely like a big step forward. I mean, one of the things that we kind of discovered like doing the process, they actually like a series of like very like sort of types of the mempool things like they call it mempool transaction pinning, where someone can actually try like create like a very like long chain transaction like transaction getting in. We like mitigated like many of them, many of the kind of like the actual kind of like attack vectors there, but some of them actually only possible to like mitigate at the like mempool level itself in terms of like Bitcoin D. Obviously, the difficult thing is that we don't really know what miners are running, but if all miners just ran full RBF, everything would be would be a lot easier for us. We can just like kind of like assume that if we have like a higher fee, things get in and it's just kind of like a little bit like just easier like parameter wise.
Also, I saw some interesting discussion around upgrading channels. So the
Yeah,
idea is that we could upgrade the channel. So I guess naively, the kind of the base level way you might be thinking is, oh, I've got to close my channel and reopen a new one. And so, but
exactly.
you had this idea of how we could potentially do this without actually closing and reopening, and actually the two channel partners can agree to upgrade to a new style of channel.
Exactly. Yeah. Because I mean, remember, like we talked about. Looks like I guess one thing is like people that are is like Lightning is kind of like evolved channels type a few times in the past. We recently kind of like had the OG type, then we had a start remote key, and we're basically about to like add anchor outputs, right? But things like many channels actually opened like in very early days, where basically they don't even have any of those two protections itself. So things like otherwise they want to maybe upgrade to like safer channel, they actually close the channels out. Close the channels, which basically chain fees also like actually will clog with the chain somewhat as well too. Basically, this is kind of like the realization that okay, well the only thing that's actually set in stone in the channel is basically defining output because like that's actually the multi-sig itself. We can't change that, right? But everything else beyond that, it's kind of like a little bit more malleable. It's actually fully dynamic. So basically, this process of like effectively like having like a zero downtime upgrade for your channels and also do it in a way that's actually desynchronized the entire network. So there's no really kind of like one coordinator. So it's kind of like ability to like apply like different features, but like do it in a way where it's fully desynchronized. Basically, do it at will whenever you want to. And so we're kind of like still working on the protocol. I have this like kind of like draft, like you say I show like a post mailing list. We got to like feedback from a bunch of good people. I'm like incorporating that into what I'm working on right now as a protocol draft. Basically, once this happens, you be able to then actually upgrade your channel on the fly. And so I think one thing like number one thing I think is basically like safety. Now people can always upgrade to basically save a channel time and also do it in a way that doesn't actually incur on-chain value. But I think another thing really cool thing is it also kind of like allows for a lot more experimentation as well too. Because now like people can actually like add new things like DLCs or whatever else. They can actually like upgrade the channel type on the fly. So, like as soon as anyone like has any like maybe new information or like new techniques or whatever else, they can integrate that into the channel immediately. Basically, and that's kind of like things the channel, but not depending on it itself.
I see. And so hypothetically, then let's say we we wanted to upgrade to PTLC, for example. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
maybe the hypothetical is like maybe in 1 or 2 years time we get Taproot, and then the Lightning Network we want to upgrade to PTLC. So would this be a mechanism for people to be able to change to PTLC channels
Uh-huh.
without closing and reopening, or how would that work?
Yes and no. I mean, so I mentioned like initially, like, it basically assumes like kind of like the funding output itself is like you set in stone. It's like if we're doing something like PLC, we kind of like need the additional excuse me, like there's no actual like taproot features. So maybe initially we kind of like actually modify the actual funding output itself. But I guess it also depends. Like so for example, like so one of the things with Taproot is like kind of like really like really like there's kind of like a lot more possibilities as far as like how you actually want to do channel further because like there's kind of like a much larger design space in the system itself. One thing we can do okay, well we want to do Taproot, so therefore we'll kind of like have like a one like a one key kind of like two type of storing thing on the chain itself, and we'll basically defer this further else. So I think one thing is basically allow people to maybe like have different channel types in the future. So because like so assuming that people already have like a kind of like a snore or whatever output in the chain or whatever else, they can upgrade to all those other things whenever they want to. I think the other cool thing is that like it doesn't require the entire network doing it at any given time, right? So like, let's say maybe people have like PTLC stuff, maybe it's like 20% of the network or whatever else. People will still be able to route through the other network because they can actually like select what they're doing based on the future bit of what's going on there.
Actually, I'm curious there. So you mentioned there that you might have some of the network using PTLC and some of the
Mm-hmm.
network using HTLC. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously the nodes would have to talk to each other, and as you said, they would do that feature negotiation to
Uh
understand,
huh.
oh, okay, I can speak PTLC, so you can speak PTLC to me.
Exactly.
But would that mean, like, how would that work with routing if does that mean your entire route must be all HTLC or all PTLC, or how would that work?
Yeah. So, but yeah, so that's like how it would be. So it's one of the things where like it's nice because like we don't have to like have like these like very like hard like upgrades. Like for example, like there's no like hard fork, right? It's kind of like more like a gradual thing. People upgrade over time. So ideally, because like PLC like solve a bunch of issues as far as like different privacy things, also like different types of like form or whatever else. People are kind of like incentivized to upgrade to that new thing. But like they can basically coexist in the network. But things like we have something we call kind of like optional required feature bit. So initially maybe it would be an option, but maybe over time people say, okay, well I only accept PTLC type payments because there are all the other things. There's also kind of like a number of really cool things you can do based off of that, like different types of things like AMP, whatever else. I think it's just kind of like a natural intention going over. I think the main thing is like people can basically upgrade on their own leisure basically over time. It's basically similar to like a soft fork, right? In terms of like people kind of like having this like more desynchronized upgrade mechanism versus like having to do things all at once. So ideally like people move over time, but you are correct in like the route would either need to be all HTLC or all PTLC. But like my node could basically support both, maybe initially, maybe like 1 year at a time. I was like, well, I'm only gonna do PTLC. Obviously, if all the routing nodes are like major routers never have to go to PTLC only, that can like enforce that kind of like adds some incentive to the client, makes the client also update some code to actually be able to route payments.
Cool. One other point I thought was interesting to just talk about is when we talk about how many payments can go through Lightning, right? So, uh, it's people make the argument that look, we can move like millions of transactions per second on theoretically on a Lightning network, and where if we compare with like credit cards, Visa, Mastercard,
Yeah.
or whatever, people might say whatever 50,000 transactions per second or something like that. But I think that's also ignoring a very important qualitative difference, right? Because with Lightning Network, and I think I've seen other people make similar points, someone like Jack Mallers or Rusty as well, that it's vastly different when we're routing on the Lightning Network because there's no fraud risk, there's no chargeback risk as well. There's no
Exactly.
waiting for
Yeah.
block confirmations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an
Yeah.
important qualitative difference, I think, that maybe people are missing when they do that comparison of Visa versus Lightning Network, let's say.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the other big thing as well, also kind of like barrier to entry, and like anyone can basically like just have like a Lightning node, and maybe have each 200 else, and basically start instantly sending payments anywhere around the world. Versus like being a minute basically like what's like actually like a gated system that can like censor other individuals, and then maybe even like have like different choke points going on as well too. So it's one of the things like it's also kind of like hard to pin it down because obviously like Visa is like one agency that can like accurately like see what's going on there, but like no one person had like the entire like global view of the entire network itself, so you can never really know. But I think one thing we kind of like seems like generally people also kind of like report their own kind of like actual network success. People like reporting in kind of like higher like monthly active users, higher page order else. We're also seeing ourselves kind of like loop traffic go up as well too. You can basically view kind of like loop traffic as kind of like a lower bound for the actual number of traffic in the network itself. So someone like maybe like does like a 10 BTC through the loop circuit itself or something like that. That means like they at least like had 10 BTC for activity going on elsewhere in the network itself. And so it's kind of like the same thing where you may not be able to accurately kind of like have a global picture of like one single number. You can kind of like extrapolate and kind of like use the heuristics based on kind of what people report to actually like get a gauge like what's going on. But generally for like talking about the companies, like things are definitely like growing as far as the network itself, and also definitely activity. So I think it's one of the things where I feel like the actual capacity maybe like is like something like a lagging or indicator itself, because like maybe the activity is going up a lot more, then we're actually bumping against the capacity kind of like utilization on, and then we actually attract more capital from there on. So.
Yeah, really interesting comment. And so when it comes to things like dealing with censorship and obviously Bitcoin people, we believe in the idea of permissionless money. I wonder, is with the current model or just with Lightning Network, is that the fact that people have a public key or your node has to be kind of like the node, I guess the node ID is public. Is that potentially a vector that people might try to censor and say, oh, let's say you're running a Lightning service and let's say, someone could come and say, or like a government or a regulator might say, I think this node ID is whatever, it's a drug market or whatever. And that, we want you to censor any payments that go to that particular node as an example. Do you see that as like a possibility, or do you think that's really not a very realistic scenario?
I mean, I guess it's definitely a possibility. Like, regulators who we've seen will go to like, pretty, kind of like drastic measures for both. I guess one thing with that is like, obviously like right now people actually maybe like typically have the IP address attached. Like you can also you have to use Tor if you really want to as far as routing. So maybe you're not necessarily like, actually revealing your location. The other thing is like the actual pub keys themselves are actually like ephemeral in a sense. And like, someone can actually have an entirely new pub key itself and then maybe like make another node that which isn't actually especially like, especially seen as being like related on the network itself, but maybe they actually have the ability to basically send payments, through themselves. So like, we talk about this whole HLC interception interception thing, right? So let's say like I'm actually like node C, but I want to basically have it be being routed through node B itself. I can like route them through node B, catch the HCLC, tell hey node C continue to forward in this direction, basically kind of like maybe like limit some of that kind of like link between the other nodes there too. So I think because like nodes can always kind of like have different identities, they can also kind of like use Tor things or whatever else. It's a little more difficult. I think the other thing with that too is that like it really depends on what they're doing, because like the way it is right now, you don't necessarily like know who sent you a payment, but you can maybe like kind of like have additional like different pathing things or whatever else. I think something where it's like I think there always like, I think no matter what matters, I think there always be kind of like the ability of the network to actually kind of like have direct like more easy access, basically, even if maybe like certain exchange or whatever else actually have like slightly like more like down like layer of it, because you can't really control the network unilaterally. There's no kind of like direct like mining or whatever else, basically like centralized transactions. I think people will always be able to kind of like find their own like freedom parts of the network or whatever else, no matter what's going on. I think also think like we'll always kind of like have additional technologies like multi-op blocks or whatever else that actually make the network more private over time. So it's always going to be kind of like this like race is like what's going on, what are they doing, what are we doing? Because I think people definitely want to have it such that the things are a lot more private. I think obviously the big thing in general is like, okay, well, like every single live transaction that happened in the past like 3 years was not recorded on the chain. And probably even hard. Like we probably saved like gigabytes, as far as like what's actually not going on the chain. So I think that's like a big thing itself, because like now there's no kind of like immutable record of everything that actually happened. You can't go back and like look 5 years ago what my node did. I mean, well, not five didn't exist maybe 3 years ago, but
Yeah, right. Yeah, those are all great points. Also, I guess just turning to the ecosystem. Obviously, you're a deep technical expert working at the protocol level, but I'm sure you have a view or you have thoughts around what you would like to see in the Lightning Network in terms of the application space. Is there anything that you would like to see there?
Super good question. Yeah, like I definitely want to see kind of like people doing a lot more kind of like fermentation with like mobile. As far as like one thing we did initially, or it's like now, it's like one thing LND is have the capabilities. The base has the capability to kind of like do kind of like what's like a custom macaroon. So basically, macaroon is basically the ability to kind of like give someone like an authentication token. That token like allows them to maybe like access like your payments or read whatever else, right? So like the cool thing you do on Android, you can actually kind of like have different applications. So I guess one thing is like I think ideally like every single like phone basically have like one node onto it. Like all the other applications basically feed into like one single node, right? So like you imagine like let's say I'm playing a game. Basically, a game like request access from my LED node on my phone. Basically, hey, I want to send up to like one BTC. Maybe like 2 times you could else. I can basically give like a very like precise credential that basically gives you the ability to do that, nothing else. So it's something really cool on that. I think kind of like a more general macaroon usage on that. And the cool thing I want people to probably mess around with something we have called LSAT, basically ability to kind of like have combine basically HTTP 402 and Lightning work together, like have like very cool kind of like authentication payment system going on there. Basically, you can imagine like maybe I can like kind of like actually like rent like disk space over time. I can like rent storage. I can kind of like have compute or else, because you can do a lot of things to come like the LSAT type mechanism there. I think those are two things off the top. I think another thing that hopefully we have coming pretty soon is basically the ability to kind of like have what are kind of like more of like a static kind of like address. Basically the ability to like kind of like a lot of people to do like maybe subscription payments or even kind of like push payments directly into the network itself. It's going to come with something we have called AMP. I think that'd be a really cool thing, because then at that point people can effectively have like what's more similar to kind of like what they think a Bitcoin address is. It actually will also be safe to reuse for other individuals, and they can also implement things like maybe like a subscription service, or maybe I pay like once a month using something like that. There's probably like a few things off the top that I think would be really cool. I guess the other thing is like once we actually kind of like allow people to like add their own channel types a lot more easily, I think people will also start to mess around with other different channel types for things like maybe something a little more specific to like their particular use case.
Yeah, I find the really interesting the one you mentioned around having some way that people who are used to the old paradigm of just saying, "Oh, here's my Bitcoin address, donate to me,"
Exactly. Yeah.
but have that in Lightning. Because I guess one of the things that people who aren't as technical or aren't as and in fairness, it's still early days,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the, I guess, obviously there's huge upsides to Lightning, but some of the downsides are that you have to your node has to be online or persistent, and
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of these different requirements around how it works, and so people have to think in a different way. But if
Exactly.
some of those things can be mitigated a little bit so that you can just put up some kind of an address to
Exactly.
receive money to,
Yeah.
kind of like that HTLC interception thing or the
Yeah,
HODL
yeah,
invoice
exactly,
idea.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like here's an example. So let's like I have like some subscription service. Maybe I need to pay them, like $10 a month, or whatever else. I have my phone. I scan like this initial QR code thing, basically my phone, then store the information. Like number one, basically stores like maybe like my ID, my account ID to them. Stores the destination, basically kind of like what the frequency of payment is itself. Then my phone basically wakes up on demand, kind of like to basically push the payment over to the other individual. The individual basically catches the payment, checks my ID, so like okay, well this is like Roasbeef's actual identity. This is his payment or whatever else, and credits me on the server itself. And that can be done like in like one simple step. Basically, I scan something on my phone, click OK, and then basically the phone does something in the background. Then we have basically ability to kind of like have like what are like authenticated like push subscription payments over Lightning, which I think is really cool. There's also a bunch of things you can do as well, where you can actually kind of like have like actually like offline like machines actually accept Lightning payments themselves. So what they can do, they can like recognize that, okay, well, this is a payment house that I created, and only I could create it themselves. And basically, the user presented the pre-image. The pre-image can only be available to them if they actually pay the actual payment. So therefore, I'll give them this candy bar. Right. So I think it has a bunch of cool things there as well. People kind of like have these really cool kind of like maker type hobby type thing. Basically, can also use that in that fashion as well. But yeah, I'm really excited about kind of like having like more of kind of like this identifier, because like I think that'd be really cool for Exchange as well, because like someone can then actually maybe even like send money into your Exchange account or something like that, host your wallet account. We just like one kind of like reusable QR code type of thing.
Excellent. And so I guess just looking at the ecosystem, are there any examples where you think someone's doing really great user experience?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, so I really like the Strike stuff. I like how they kind of like have this like hybrid between the credit card and actual lighting itself, where people maybe don't really know like what's going on in the background. As far as what they have going in there. So there's people like doing some cool things as well. It's kind of like different ways to do authentication, where you maybe have like your phone actually authenticate via your website. You can like have it like it'll be like a little more seamless thing. I'm really big kind of like dual anything like kind of like involves like actually like doing like more like native like web type authentication payments as far as what's going on there. Well, I think Phoenix also do some cool things as far as like, really like pushing the envelope sort of like UX. So basically have a system like similar to some things we do, where they can actually like have a user can like have like very like minimize onboarding time basically, but still do so in a way where it's still like basically the user still controls the keys at the end of the day, which I think is probably like one of the most important things. I think we've definitely seen people like really like push the edge as far as like different like innovation at the wallet level, UX level, and things like that. And I think we'll see a lot more of that going on as we start to add some additional kind of capability protocol level, which basically support these more advanced use cases.
Yeah, and so over time, well, in the earlier days, it was you had to be really way more technical, and there was a lot more stumbling blocks around this.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
over time, it seems like things are becoming a lot easier, and it's becoming a lot more of a slick user experience as people are figuring out ways to make it a nice experience for the Lightning user. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah, what are your thoughts in terms of, let's say another 1 year's time? Do you think there'll be way more people on Lightning or
Mm-hmm.
similar to what we have
Mm-hmm.
now?
Oh yeah, really good question. Yeah, I think there would be more, because I think people were kind of like figuring out like because like yeah, I think you're right, and definitely like it was kind of like really moving to like a new paradigm. People were like, okay, well, I have two balances. How do I communicate my two balances? How do I communicate like reserve? How do I communicate amount of capacity, whatever else? I think people were kind of like really like working through all those obstacles basically to give them kind of like much better experience. I think maybe like in a year or so from now, I think Mo Wallet maybe we'll have similar things like HLC interception. We all figure out. I think we'll have like definitely a bunch of other tools to basically allow people to kind of like acquire channels a lot more easily, to basically do a lot more rebalancing on there, and to basically make things a lot more step for people actually operating on the endpoint of it itself. I think we'll see kind of like a lot more usage of like Lightning in the web, as far as like people maybe like having like a Western type thing, maybe even like using different permissions to basically like allow people to like finally like get rid of these like paywalls, and actually maybe do authentication directly via that. I think we'll also see maybe like gaming extra take off somewhat as well, with people kind of like figure out like what's the proper kind of like incentive or kind of like mechanism design to actually like make these games a little more compelling, and like not just like just not just like directly tipping, basically kind of like have like a lot more like have the payments actually be like more core part of the game. So yeah, I mean, I think the one thing is like I've always been continually impressed by all things developers are doing. So obviously I can like think of like some of them, but I kind of like give them the tools, and they just surprise as far as like all these things they're making. I think it's one of the biggest things. Like, Lightning has like such a like a large development community, and I think definitely understated. I think even now like people are still doing all these like meetups themselves, virtual things like hackathons or whatever else. I think that's like one of the coolest things, just to basically see it over time, continue to grow beyond that. And yeah, there's so many people doing really cool stuff.
Excellent. I think, yeah, we're seeing a lot of growth in terms of the ecosystem and people being able to easily use Lightning. So, Laolu, I've really enjoyed chatting with you. If listeners would like to find you or Lightning Labs online, where can they find you?
Oh yeah, you can find me on Twitter, twitter.com/roastbeef. That's roastbeef with no T. I'm also roastbeef for just about everything else. Been that way since like eighth grade. You can find us, github.com/lightning labs, or go to lightning.engineering. It's kind of like our base site, and we have a bunch of other things, linking from there too, and check out our repos. Yeah, and also twitter.com/lightning is also us. That's Lightning Labs on Twitter. We have the snag, the cute little handle. So that was nice.
Well done with that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank Elizabeth for that. She pulled off, she put off some hookups.
Nice. Yeah. Well, look, I really enjoyed chatting with you. It was really, really educational for me. So thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, man.
Show notes are available at stefanlivera.com/207. Thanks, and I'll see you in the Citadels.